David Wood is a member of the Society of Christian Philosophers. He's been in more than 40 moderated public debates with Muslims and really knows what he's talking about. In fact, he's one of the premier authorities in the world on Islam. And David, we are delighted to have you on the broadcast.
Hey, how's it going, Hank?
Doing good. I wanted to ask you about contrast the Jesus of the Bible with the Jesus of the Quran. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, this is, on the one hand, it's kind of encouraging to see Muslims agreeing with us on so many things. And Muslims agree with us on a lot of things about Jesus that most other people in the world don't agree with us on. So, for instance, Muslims believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. Who agrees with us that Jesus was born of a virgin? Well, Muslims do. Muslims agree that Jesus lived the most miraculous life in history. So everyone else in history, they say Jesus was the most miraculous. So they believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They believe that he had a miraculous end to his earthly existence. They don't believe he died and rose from the dead, but they believe that Allah miraculously rescued him. And they believe that Jesus is going to return to play some important role in a future judgment. So we look at that and we see a lot of common ground between us and Muslims, and those can be very interesting points of to lead off in conversations. But Muslims do that as well. Muslims draw attention to these similarities to say, hey, you Christians, you believe Jesus was born of a virgin? We do too. You believe that that Jesus performed miracles? We do too. You believe that Jesus is the Messiah? We do too. So look at all this common ground we have, and Muslims will use that in their efforts at dawah, which is sort of Muslim evangelism. What's interesting is that when we look at the areas where they disagree with us on, it's kind of exactly what you would expect given what the gospel is in the New Testament. In other words, when the apostles went out and preached the gospel, Jesus had taught them many things, but when they condensed it, what is the core message of the gospel? They always preached about Jesus' death for sins, his resurrection, and that we have to submit to him as Lord. So death, resurrection, and deity. This was the takeaway message from the apostles. And when we look at Islam agrees with us about Jesus on almost everything else except those three things. They'll say Jesus didn't die on the cross, he didn't rise from the dead, and he's not Lord. So the Christian response when Muhammad came along should have been something along the lines of, wow, we've been expecting you, because we've been told that false teachers and false prophets are going to come and corrupt the gospel, and you've just nailed all the core of the gospel while agreeing with us on so much else.
Talk about the misunderstanding that a Muslim would have, or the misapprehension with respect to the phrase Son of God, where Allah contends that this has to do with sexual procreation, whereas a Christian says that this has to do with special relationship.
Yeah, it's really actually a problem for Islam. In other words, if a 7th century Arab caravan trader like Muhammad hears Christians talking about the Son of God and misunderstands the phrase and thinks that we're talking about God producing an offspring, that wouldn't be very surprising, but we would at least expect God to know what we mean by the phrase Son of God and to respond to what we actually believe. But what we find in the Quran is that Allah says, how can he have a son when he has no wife? And so it's presupposed in the Quran that the only way for God to have a son is to have a husband and wife. Now, on a kind of side note, what's interesting about that is when the angel announces to Mary in the Quran that she's going to have a son, she raises the same objection. How can I have a son when no man has touched me? And Allah's response is, it's easy for Allah. So in one part, it's impossible for God to have an offspring without having a wife, but Mary can have an offspring without having a husband. So a bit of an inconsistency there. But when you look at the Bible, there are a variety of uses for the phrase Son of God. It can mean that you sort of reflect God's will, like when it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers; they shall be sons of God." There, we're not, God's not producing an offspring. We have a kind of family resemblance if we're doing God's will. Israel is called God's son because God sort of plays a direct role in starting Israel and so on. And Jesus is the Son of God in a unique sense in terms of his relationship with the Father and because he's the Messiah. But what's interesting is of all the different uses of Son of God, angels are called sons of God in certain contexts and so on, but of all the different uses of Son of God, none of them have anything to do with God actually physically producing an offspring. And yet, according to the Quran, that's the only thing Christians can mean. And so Muslims look at this and say, you Christians have a problem because you're saying that God has a son. And the response should be, no, you Muslims have a problem because your God who wrote your book didn't know what we even mean by the phrase Son of God, and so can't be a revelation from God.
It'd be one thing for Muhammad to misunderstand, quite another for Allah.